On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Liran Eisenberg. He is the Senior Director of Data Engineering at 2U. We're going to be talking about scaling and, in particular, data engineering. We're going to be covering areas about some of the challenges behind recruiting, about retention, some of the scaling issues when it comes to hiring data engineers and building out your program at scale. Liran, thanks for being on the podcast.
Sure, my pleasure.
Absolutely. So, if you could, for everyone listening, to provide a little context in terms of what your responsibilities are as the Director of Data Engineering and also what 2U does, and we'll dive right in.
TU is a education technology company, but it differs from a lot in the field in the sense that TU does not only provide you a platform, but it's an actual operator of higher education, boot camps, and short courses. Within the organization, I manage the data engineering group who deals with data analytics, everything that has to do both with internal data and external data sets for the benefit of our mostly data science and marketing stakeholders.
It's probably a hot spot to be given COVID and learning platforms and learning remotely. I think you guys got to be busy and piling up more data, I'm sure. And I know in the vein of the topic, talking about scaling in terms of data engineering in particular, I guess let's start at the top. I'd be kind of curious to get your thoughts when you're looking at data engineering and within the context of other technology roles when it comes to scaling. What are you seeing as some of the challenges around building out your data engineering capabilities?
Well, there's quite a few challenges, but let's begin with the human factor because technology challenges are much easier to overcome, but the human factor is the biggest puzzle piece to be dealt with. It all starts with the definition of data engineering. Within every organization, it means something slightly different. So when you are talking about data engineering, for instance, in my case, throughout my career, it was always about data analytics. It's not always the same with every organization. A lot of companies have a combination of DevOps with data ops, which are also referred to as data engineering. Or they may rebrand the database admins as data engineers. Or it might just be a full stack developer who's on call and deals with the data elements as well, who's performing a data engineering role. So when you're talking about scaling begins both by retaining the people that you have, training them so they can grow, but also hiring because you need to scale. That requires more people. It's really hard to find the right people to apply for your positions when you're publishing something, a new job description, because they tend to be generic in nature. For instance, in recent years, most of the positions I've published had Python skills required as part of them. But what is Python skills for a data engineer? That's much harder to come by as a definition. For instance, does someone who knows how to use pandas, does that mean you know enough Python to be a data engineer? Not really. So it always is a challenge to define what is the skill sets of data engineering within your organization, both present and future. What would you like to see? That's one element. The other element from a human factor is also the expectation. You are hiring people, whether they're new people or existing people, to perform a role. The scope of the role really details whether or not they would be interested in it. Obviously, the aim is always to set expectation in such a manner that people are engaged and working on things of interest. But there's also reality of things that need to be done that, they're part of the grind of day-to-day life. Setting expectations, I think, from day one, even during the hiring process itself, helps you eliminate a lot of question marks, both for you and a candidate. For example, I've always tried to have a take-home exam reflect not just what is the knowledge of the candidate, but what is the daily work that this candidate would look and find within the role so we can set expectations.
Let me ask you a question because I think you bring up an interesting point when it comes to just the initial recruiting job descriptions. they're written generically. I guess in your view, why are they written generically?
Well, the aim is typically to attract as many potential candidates as you can, so you would be able to skim through and find those who are of interest to you. Personally, I find that as data engineering grows over time, because 10 years ago, this wasn't an issue. If I were to publish Python skills, I would hardly get anyone with Python skills. But today, everyone knows Python, or most candidates do. As things evolve and certain traits become more common across multiple roles, I find that it's much better if you have 15 required skills just to list out, instead of all of them, list out the top three and avoid in the job description everything else because you're looking for people with a specific skill set. Data engineering is a speciality. It doesn't help me if people know 80% of the role of quantity wise of the skill sets if the role is actually maybe 10% comprised of those skills and 90% are the top three, which are really what they need to be. So when you are recruiting a specialist, then aim for that special knowledge.
And I hear you. I'm on the recruiting side of the world. I was in the data world way back, so I understand some of the nuances of being recruited in the data field, and then also now on the recruiting side, I see some of the challenges of what happens and trying to attract. And I guess when you're looking at trying to boil down the essence of those core jobs, do you feel like on average, most job descriptions, and I'm not just talking, where you're at now, but this can just be on the universe. You've applied to plenty of jobs yourself in your career and, have posted plenty of jobs. Do you think people are writing for the audience specifically? Like, meaning, I am looking for this data engineer. In this case, when we're talking about data engineering, has, let's say 4, 5, 6 attributes I need. A couple of them are really technical skills. Are those job descriptions being really written for that audience that you're looking to pick up? Because as you mentioned, trying to catch a wider band's good, but you're going to get a lot of outliers that you probably never wanted to see unless you're looking for that diamond in the rough, anyways.
Well, I never found a formula that works for that,
Yeah.
unfortunately. There's no consistency today as to what is the best place to advertise, other than the fact that never changed over 25 years of my career, that you hire the best people, or it's easy to hire wonderful people when you know them already and you bring them along. That's always helps. But when you're talking about what are the odds of a candidate not only interested in your role, but also able to find it? I mean, where would you publish it? LinkedIn? Maybe, but what if they don't go there? What if they go to a different website? It's much easier to catch contractors than it is to hire permanent roles. If you publish a contractor role within Dice or Monster, you're going to find them within 24 hours. But there's just no consistency of where can you find the candidates that you're looking for. So it's really hard to custom fit the job description based on the platform itself.
It's interesting because data engineering is also evolving. It seems like it's changing. It's getting, traditional ETL has kind of given way to a data engineer that's a specialized software engineer to me. I could be wrong. I mean, obviously, like you mentioned, it's defined differently at every org potentially, but it's a much different skill set, smaller talent pool. And as you mentioned, people have to find you, which is a challenge, right? I mean, they're also being bombarded by recruiters as well. So not only do will they find you, their inbox is filled, so they're underwater trying to find the right fit for themselves. When you're looking at some of these challenges, obviously that exist, what are your thoughts like in terms of when it comes to actually helping build out your own internal data engineers? Taking people who are more junior, building up the skill set. Obviously, most managers have projects to deliver, so that is an overhead, but are you looking at those type of alternatives as you're trying to scale teams just because of the lack of resources available?
I would contend that even if resources were available, there's a lot of advantages of taking a specialist in any field, especially within data engineering, literally any field, of taking a homegrown candidate investing in that candidate and making that leap into a new role. And there's quite a few advantages, but it also reminds me of a nice quote by Warren Buffett of someone sitting in the shade today because someone planted a tree long ago. So if you're looking at an internal candidate, someone has vetted that person. That person showed potential. That person has demonstrated their capabilities. That person has also became familiar with the company. So does that mean that their internal mobility should be hindered because of the fact that they already have a role? Not really. Over time, if you enable growth and enable internal mobility, yes, you may need to invest more initially, but just think of how much are you investing in finding people? And what happens when you find the wrong people and they leave? Or they cause morale issues, or you can't really set expectations right with them, and onboarding them takes a lot longer because of it. So if you're talking about senior people, obviously you cannot take someone from support, for instance, and make them into a data engineer as a senior person. But juniors, it's wonderful as an approach, I think, and I've used it often.
Do you see, I guess, on the flip side, the technology in the space is changing pretty rapidly? Is part of, I guess, in terms of when you're looking at balancing the needs of the team, everyone's always looking for senior. Some of the reasons you're looking for senior, obviously, the different challenges, different, the evolution of the technology stack as it's going. When would you consider your team comfortable to bring somebody on to mentor from, like, let's say, a more junior role within the company? They want the mobility. When are some of those opportunities that will present themselves to kind of bring somebody in like that?
Well, you mentioned mentorship, and I think mentorship here is a key determining factor on scaling. I'm former military, spent a decade in the army. And despite common misconception that the army is based on the fact that people are ordered to function and they follow orders, in reality, people follow orders because they believe in the people who are giving the orders and they have common goals and common understanding. It's also true here when you're talking about mentorship. Mentorship is the element that really makes everything glued together. You can describe a role, you can set expectations, but at the end of the day, people need to follow a path which is semi baked. You can't really plan everything in advance. Think of all the any contingency that you're going to have. And with a mentor, that's the human element that really enables a candidate, once accepted into a role, shine. Now, with mentorship, obviously, you want to keep it one to one, meaning one mentor, one mentee at any given point in time. And mentorship takes time. It's not a 2 week sprint and that's over. Typically, it would last at least months. It could become a lifetime relationship, but it doesn't have to be an official one at some point. But I would contend that if you are planning on mentorship, introducing it, then a mentor has to be a senior person always, because you want to learn from experience, not only from a technical perspective, but also in life. And you have to plan it ahead. So there's a combination of teaching the technical skills that are required, which is independently done from a mentor. For instance, within my role, I have several senior engineers who mentor junior engineers. And I've always made the distinction. If you have a mentee who requires more knowledge about a topic, it doesn't mean that your role as a mentor is to teach it. Your role is to assist your mentee in getting the assistance that they need. So we might, for instance, set up lessons, whether they're per topic or on a regular cadence, to deal with that gap. It doesn't have to be part of the mentorship responsibility. A mentor cannot cover all aspects of life within the team, but the mentor can certainly facilitate getting to the needs. And often a mentee, they're having a hard time to really vocalize what they're actually looking for. So if you make that distinction between technical training, which is your responsibility, I think, as a manager towards the people in your team, and the human factor of not just the prioritization, but the attitude, the professional mannerism that you expect people to gain, that comes from human interactions. That's where a mentor can really shine a light.
Something interesting in the sense of, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head of having, the mentee understand that there's other tools and people that can help support them, and the mentor is really there to help guide and navigate them towards those answers. On the flip side, I think a lot of times you see hiring managers, have a need for, let's say, senior person, right? So, I mean, obviously they have a specific problem they're looking to solve. And sometimes you see that there's a tipping point of they're willing to wait 3 months, 6 months, 12 months to make that hire. And I guess sometimes from the outside in looking at it, you're like, well, I wonder if you could find your mid level engineer and help build them towards solving the problem you're looking to solve. And at some point, is waiting longer to find the ideal resource just not pertinent? I mean, is it not relevant? Is it impacting the company negatively by trying to find the person that comes in as plug and play?
I think there's really no single answer for this because a lot of this has to do with the dynamics of the organization.
Sure.
So let's consider two different scenarios. In one, you have a need that is based on a project with a senior person, but without any need for proprietary knowledge about the company itself. That's typically things that you find in software engineering and less common in data engineering because data engineering is typically, when you're talking about a senior person, it's not just the technology knowledge, it's also the context of how the data relates to the org. That's why it's very hard to hire a senior person on day one. They may have a lot of knowledge about data engineering, but to provide the value, they also need the relevancy. Now, data engineering is a black box for everyone receiving the information from, but data engineering cannot be a black box internally. We have to always be content aware of the nature of the data that we're dealing with. It's kind of repetitive over years. I mean, if you work in finance, then you know the nature of the data without the specifics of the company necessarily. You can make that gap. But it's really hard, for instance, to take someone who worked in finance, for instance, and apply the same knowledge on non transactional data, such as advertising, which is totally different from the nature of the data that you're talking to. Should you wait? Well, that really depends on can you wait and what happens if you don't. There are places in which, there are organizations in which, if you're not hiring, well, you can always take a contractor in the meanwhile to at least gap the skill set from a more experienced person. There are places in which you cannot. There are places in which it's easy for you to find a mid-level engineers, and there are places in which it's the same amount of effort. So if I'm investing the same amount and what I really want is a senior person, then I'll wait until I find a senior person. Should you wait 12 months? Personally, I think it's less than ideal, but I've had occurrences in my life in which I had to wait 6 months or more, never a year, but 6 months or more for the right candidate because it was a custom fit position. And it was something I could not grow someone in unless I would wait years for that growth.
Interesting. I'm curious to get your take on this. When you're looking at technologies that are coming out, emerging technologies, and potential solutions in the data engineering space, obviously, if it's really new, you run the risk of not being able to find talent to maybe support the necessary, knowledge behind it. Does that play a factor in ever in terms of deciding, when or if to leverage the technology? Do you ever consider, well, this is fantastic, but who's going to do the work? Can we train somebody on it? Can I go find talent in this?
Sure. And Python is a good example for this. Python used to be, I would say, a lot less common if you look at how many people used Python 12, 15 years ago. It was on the decline for many years and it came back with the age of the cloud. Choosing Python, for instance, as your main language for data engineering, it's a sensible choice because onboarding people and making them senior people, or at least intermediate level, and Python is a low hanging fruit versus other languages like, for instance, Java. So Let's assume for a second, and I'm not saying it is, let's assume Scala, Java, they're better and faster. The question is, would you notice it from the scale that you have? And how much more effort it will be for you to convert your existing code because you're not starting fresh. You always have something. And just train everyone that you need to deal with, because again, data engineering doesn't work in a vacuum. You work with other people. You also have to take into account all of the environment that you're using, all of the supporting people that you have with you, like support, like DevOps. Does it warrant the shift? Would you get enough from that major investment? Now, sometimes you would, sometimes you wouldn't. I would say that unless you're talking about a really high velocity of data in a large scale, I mean, you're going to invest a lot of time and effort for an even smaller audience of potential candidates. Do you really need to do this? Now, there's also alternatives. Do you really need to write data pipelines as a data engineer? I mean, it really depends on the nature of the data pipeline. For instance, if you're bringing in data from Salesforce, which is common enough, do you need to write it yourself or maybe buy a tool or platform that does this for you? You can scale a lot, but taking on responsibilities that only your team can handle and scale out those traits and those skill sets for a platform when it makes sense. But for instance, I'll give you another example. If you have to interact with custom APIs all the time, having a platform is not going to save you much because you're going to invest the same amount of time and need to deal with a platform. So why bother? Look at Airflow for another example. It's an workflow management tool. I'm a data engineer. I'm not DevOps. Do I want to manage Airflow? Obviously not. I don't care about it that much. I want to establish a DAG using Airflow. Does it make sense for me to use and manage Airflow? Well, it does a lot more than having to deal with the infrastructure itself. It's not really part of who I am. Even if I did that, that's a skill set that is DevOps oriented. The fact that I may have permissions and may have the chops to do it doesn't mean I should be investing my time in it. So you need to focus, much like looking for a candidate, once you have a person in the role, try to establish the core functionality that you cannot buy out, that you have to perform yourself with a human. And that's a good method of scaling.
When you're looking at obviously data engineering is a need for everyone. If you're having trouble finding it, then good chance a lot of other organizations are as well. What do you do on the retention side? Obviously, tons of opportunity presents great things for people to find different things, different challenges. Obviously, losing someone on a data engineering team less than ideal. It's a like you mentioned, it's not just the understanding of the actual hard skills, but the understanding of the relation of the data is an overhead, is a ramp up time. I guess for yourself, like what's your view on retention, growing staff, making sure people are content to stay? Because obviously you'd hate to have to go back.
There's a lot into this. I would say that to start off, you need to look at why people leave. And people may choose to leave because of higher compensation, obviously. I mean, hell, if someone will offer us that amount of money, there's a price point in which everyone will probably shift their roles.
Yep.
For $1 billion, you would do things in a different org that you may not consider as relevant today.
Very true.
So, looking at why people actually leave, it's less about compensation unless, fine print, you're paying below market value. So, as long as you're within market value, compensation isn't going to be the reason. People leave because they're unhappy personally, either with the team members or their managers, which is something you can control. You can create a good working environment. You can have good working relationship. It doesn't have to be a personal relationship, but at least from a work perspective, it could be positive. People leave because they don't feel a connection to their role. Now, that's more tricky. What is your role? That is something that is always to the beholder's viewpoint of what am I doing versus what I think I should be doing. And that drills down to communication skills. As a manager, especially as a senior manager, you set the tone. You need to be transparent in expectations, both internally and externally. What do we do? How do we do it? What is the potential for growth for an engineer within a specific rank? How do you grow as an engineer? And make it not just words, but make it a reality. I'll give you an example. Within literally every position I've ever had, I've managed teams. On day one, the human factor was the first thing I was always looking at. If I'm an engineer, from that perspective, what growth opportunities are being offered to me? What expectations are being set towards me and how? And can I even get any feedback or have any visibility into this? Again, this is less about the engineer itself. This is about management. This is about not just enabling it, but actively pursuing and promoting growth for your team and thus being able to retain them because they're engaged and being transparent in such a manner that, you're not going to do everything that you love. Otherwise, retention wouldn't be a problem. But if you're doing some percentage which is viable for you to do, and you still have growth opportunities, then you're gonna stay because you're gonna be happy. But if all you're gonna do is the mundane work that you're not interested in, well, it's personality based, but some personalities, that's gonna be the tipping point for them. So you have to know the people you're working with. I wouldn't say you need to fit the solution for the people because people change over time and you need to be not just realistic, but also fair to others. If you have two people in the same role, they should have the same scope of role and same compensation band. But at least you can also provide them some growth, for instance, like a personal project or personal responsibilities in which they would be unique and you would be able to fit their expectations and promote their growth and happiness. But that's manager's role.
Let me ask you a question, kind of left field, but you made me think about this. And so a lot of times, you know, people get promoted into management because it's a career path. They might be the best engineer. There's a reason, right? They may want to go into management, but we necessarily don't always promote the best people managers into management. Sometimes it's actually taking our best technical assets and moving them into management because obviously they need to oversee other technical minded people. So it might be easier, but then they might not have the best traits, aptitude, whatever you want to call it, to manage people, to understand some of what you talked about, some of the dynamics of retention is how keenly the managers understanding the dynamics within the team, being able to anticipate things. Obviously, those are all going to help. But what are your thoughts? Like, I mean, obviously, people want a career ladder. Management is the next step for most, to go into, but it's a bit tricky because it's maybe not the best skill set long term for them.
Well, let's look at an engineer for a second and then look at a broader aspect of this. What is the definition of growth for an engineer? Well, it is obviously growth from a technical perspective of knowing more and having more experience. It is obviously about compensation, of getting validation for the amount of knowledge and experience that you got by getting increased compensation to facilitate that. Again, with market value and scope as well. Not everyone is interested in management. Management is a function. It's not necessarily the function that you would consider as a promotion. Yes, it's more responsibility, but then again, being a senior engineer is also a lot of responsibility as well. Do you want to be less hands on? That's not always the case with senior data engineers, but that would be reality for any advancement in leadership to that kind of role. If you're looking to apply both your technical knowledge alongside people skills, then certainly advancing into management roles makes sense. If not, well, there's no shame, nothing bad in being a senior engineer or, as time goes by, moving to more of an architect role in which you are the main expert and you relay knowledge and you're a focal point, but not necessarily a people manager. So there's really no one answer for this. But let's look at an organization for a second. What is a CEO? A CEO is the heart of the company at the end of the day because that's the top level executive that you have. Typically, what are they? They tend to be sales oriented. Even with an engineering company, do you really want your top engineer as a CEO? Or do you want the CEO to be your top spokesperson, the person that can have the vision and create the kind of culture, both internally and with your customers, that you wish to have a sustainable marketplace? Leadership is not about you. Leadership is about what is currently the gap that needs to be filled by you. Looking again at the roles, there are companies in which you have highly technical people doing non technical roles in leadership. That is because they're best suited to perform that role for a variety of reasons. And you have non technical people fulfilling technical senior roles for the same reason. I don't think a data engineer is any different.
Absolutely. That's interesting. That's a great point of view. And I think a lot of times we have preconceived notions of what we believe a path should be. And I do agree with you. Some people, technical leadership can fulfill what they want. And obviously, you mentioned increased compensation is always nice to validate your level of authority and expertise. And so, yeah, management's tricky because I think, the people management component, not often enough do we have training in that. I think a lot of times people expect you to watch other people, maybe pick it up and kind of just figure out what's the best way for you to be a people manager. I think it's a lot of stress. That's hard. I mean, not everyone learns that way, but there's less professional development maybe that goes into that stage than early in your career when you need the hard skills, which are easier to be taught, to take classes, to take go to university, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I can give you another analogy. Being a parent, I've got twin boys, which are currently in their toddler age, and they're certainly giving me a school in life. So if you think about the role of a parent, the role of a parent is not to manage their kids. The role of the parent, again, everyone has a different perspective, but from my perspective, it's enabling them growth to become independent and make good choices in life. It's also true when you're talking about leadership of teams. You're trying, again, from my perspective, not to micromanage everything. You try to set the framework in such a manner that they can be as independent as they can within a scope. So obviously, you don't want engineers to make all the decisions, much like I don't like my toddlers making all the decisions for me. Otherwise, we'll all be eating chicken nuggets every day until the end of our lives. But do you want to enable to make choices, to give room for exploration? And you do want to promote the successes and learn from the mistakes. And that is your role as a leader. It's not about telling them what to do, it's about showing them how we can actually grow. Not telling them, but showing them. There's a difference. And every parent out there can probably relate to that.
Yes, it is funny because I'm a big believer in teaching them is about the only thing you can do as a parent because at some point they're going to apply some knowledge, and if they don't have it, they will still apply something. Whatever they have, they will use, or they'll pick up a different tool to fill in the gap. And I think it's an interesting analogy. I think it's very true. I think it's a great point. Awesome, man. Cognizant of our time. Love chatting with you. I think we could probably easily record a second part. We might have to have you come on to dive in to some more of this topic down the road. If somebody wants to reach out to you regarding anything you've said on the podcast, is LinkedIn or another avenue good to do
Oh,
that?
LinkedIn's fine. It's easy to find me. Not a lot of people with Swiss names. So it's Liran, my first name. Eisenberg is Eisenberg. And I don't look like I look in today's world. I have a pre COVID haircut there, but it's easy to find me.
We'll include your LinkedIn profile in the show notes in case anyone does want to reach out to kind of talk to you about some of what you talked about. I think you shared a lot. Thank you for being on. Thank you for sharing. It's been fantastic.
My pleasure.
Absolutely. And that's it for this episode. We'll be back again. Different guests, different topic. Two things I always ask for is, if you're sharing the podcast, I appreciate that. People are listening and the subscription rates are kind of going up, and it's awesome to see that. So thank you for doing that. If somebody can find use of a topic, please let them know of the episode of the podcast. And then the other is, if you want me to talk about something, topic with a guest, feel free to message me on LinkedIn. Let me know. I'm always gathering a list of topics to have to find guests for. And until next time, thanks.